locked in the cellar for 7 years. A Lakota chief broke the lock and gave her the sky again. The first thing I noticed about the lock was that it was wrong. Not broken, not rusted through. Wrong. The hasp was bent outward, not inward, which meant somebody hadn't pried it open from the outside. Somebody had driven against it from below, from inside. Again and again, I figured, judging by the wood around the hinge, the splinters driven down into the dirt like they'd been hammered by something desperate and small. I stood there in what was left of that trading post, the Garnett brothers' place, or what had been theirs before the army came through and found what they'd done, and I looked at that cellar door for a long time. Ash still drifting. Smell of green pine burning wrong because somebody had tried to build a wall out of it and failed. My second, Chayton, was 10 paces behind me. He didn't speak. He'd learned years ago that when I went still like that, I was reading something, and the reading took as long as it took. The door was about 4 feet square, rough-cut pine, iron strap hinges, and that bent hasp. A length of chain had been threaded through a bracket nailed into the frame. The chain was gone, the army, I supposed, or whoever had come through first. But the bracket was still there, and it had been hammered in hard and deep. 7, 8 nails. Somebody had wanted that door to stay down. I crouched and pulled it open. The smell came up before the dark did. Not decay, not quite. Something older and drier than that, like the inside of a stone that's been sealed a long time. Chayton made a sound behind me. I didn't turn. I just held the door and let my eyes go down the steps into that dark, and I waited. She was in the corner. You get older, you think you stop being surprised by what one man will do to another. I've seen a lot. I've buried a lot. But I stood at the top of those steps and I looked at what 7 years in that hole had made of a human being, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the wall. She had her back against it and her knees up and her hands flat on the dirt floor on either side of her, like she was ready to push herself upright if she needed to. Her hair was long past her shoulders, matted in sections, pale where it had probably been brown. She was thin in the way that means the body has spent a long time with very little and has learned to carry itself differently. Her dress, what was left of it, was patched with what looked like feed sack. She was barefoot. She didn't look up when the light came in. I didn't go down the steps yet. I just said plainly, "The men who kept you here are gone." Nothing. "The door is open. I'm not going to come down unless you want me to. You can come up when you're ready." Still nothing, but her hands moved. Just slightly, her fingers pressed a little harder into the dirt, like she was anchoring herself. I stayed at the top. I didn't speak again. Chayton came up beside me, looked down, looked at me. I shook my head. We waited. It was maybe 10 minutes, could have been more. The sun was moving. Then she stood up. Slowly, the way someone does when they're not sure their legs will hold. She stood and she put one hand on the wall and she looked up the steps, and for the first time she looked at me. Her eyes were gray. That's the thing I remember. Not frightened. Not empty either, the way you sometimes see in people who have been through too much, that flat, gone look. These eyes were watching, taking me in, figuring, measuring. Whatever they'd done to her down there, they hadn't gotten to whatever was behind those eyes. She took the steps one at a time, her hand on the wall, and she came up into the light. She stood there and she turned her face toward the sun, and she closed her eyes, and she just breathed. I've thought about that moment more times than I can count. A woman coming up out of 7 years of dark and turning her face to the sky. I didn't know then what that moment was going to cost me or give me. I just stood there and watched it, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something I didn't have a name for in either tongue. My name is Lakota. My father gave me that name because he said I was born already belonging to everyone, Lakota, friend to all. He had a way of seeing things in children that hadn't come out yet. He was right about me mostly. I was never a man who held himself apart from others. But that had been a long time ago. I won't lay out my whole life for you here like a list of wounds. That's not how I think about it. But you need to know a few things to understand what that cellar door meant to me, what the woman who came out of it would come to mean to me. I was somewhere past 50 by then. My best count puts me at 53. The winters had been hard ones, one after another, and my body knew it even if I didn't much talk about it. My left knee had been wrong since a horse came down on it in the early days of the war with the Crow, before the long peace. My lower back, come cold weather, could make me stop mid-stride and just stand still until it decided to let me move again. I had been chief of my band, a mixed band, Lakota and a few Lakota families who'd come in after the sickness took their people, for going on 12 years. 12 years is a long time to lead. Long enough to know what you can't fix. Long enough to watch the world that made sense to you get smaller every season, the old ways dropping away not because the young people didn't want them, but because the world outside kept pressing in, hard and constant, like a thumb on the throat. My wife Winona had been dead 6 years, not killed, sick, chest sickness, the kind that takes a long time and doesn't leave much room for not knowing how it ends. I sat with her through all of it. I did everything I knew how to do and some things I didn't. It wasn't enough. I've made my peace with that, or I've tried to. But the peace isn't complete. There's a corner of it that's still not quiet. After Winona died, I think I went on doing the things a chief does mostly from habit. Because the people needed it and because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I held councils, I mediated, I went where I was needed. I was not unkind. I was not absent, but something in me had pulled back, the way a fire burns lower after you stop feeding it. I was doing the shape of things without the heat behind it. Chayton saw it. He never said so. Chayton is not that kind of man. But I saw him watching me sometimes with a look that wasn't worry exactly, more like attention, like he was keeping track. I was the one who decided we should go see what had happened at the Garnett brothers' post. We'd heard the army had moved through there, some kind of investigation. We had our own reasons for knowing what had happened. We'd traded there. Some of my people had, back when old Jonas Garnett had run it straight. His sons had taken it over 3 years ago and it had gone bad fast. We'd stopped going, but we'd heard things, rumors that didn't quite settle. So I took Chayton and 3 others, and we rode the 2-day trail out there, and we found the burnt timber and the army's tracks already 2 days cold, and I found that cellar door. And I found her. Her name was Me Colton, she told me, though the name came out slow like she'd had to dig for it. She'd been brought to the Garnett brothers' post at the age of 19. She was 26 now. She told me this not all at once but in pieces, over the better part of that day and the next as we made camp nearby. She wouldn't go far from the open sky. She slept outside both nights, which I understood. She sat close to the fire, not for warmth, it was midsummer, but for the light, I thought. She'd press her face toward it the way she had toward the sun. How she'd gotten there in the first place is a grim story that doesn't need all its details told. A wagon party, bad men, long way from anywhere. The brothers had considered her their property, which is a word I've heard white men use that never stops being strange to me. Property. As if any part of the living world belongs to a man, just because he's strong enough to hold it. She didn't tell me the worst of it, but I'm not a fool. I could see what years of that had done. Not to her spirit, that was clear and intact in a way that was almost startling given everything, but to the way she moved, the way she positioned herself in relation to other people, always with the exit visible, always with her back to something solid, always watching hands. What I could also see, and this came clearer over the 2 days, was what those 7 years had not touched. She was sharp. She had a dry, spare way of saying things that wasn't quite humor but lived in the same county. She watched everything. She asked questions that went straight to what mattered, and she listened to the answers the way most people don't, not waiting for her turn, not already forming what she was going to say next, just listening. The second morning, she asked me what I intended to do with her. I told her the truth. I intended to take her to the nearest town, which was a settlement called Ridgeport, 4 days' ride east. There was an army outpost there and a handful of civilians. She could get her bearings. I didn't know if she had family. She said she didn't. Not anymore, or none she knew of. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the fire. She said, "What if I don't want to go to a town?" I told her that was her business, but I asked where she'd go instead. She said she didn't know yet. But she'd been in a hole for 7 years and she wasn't ready to go into another one. And a lot of towns, in her experience, were holes with windows. I thought about that. She wasn't wrong. We broke camp that morning and started east. I had it in my mind that she'd figure out what she wanted as we rode, that the motion and the light and the days would start to settle something in her. I wasn't thinking beyond that. I was just trying to get her somewhere safe, which seemed like the decent thing, and then get back to my own life and my own people. I wasn't accounting for what my own life looked like, but she was. Apparently, from early on, she was watching that too. She rode like she'd ridden before, which surprised me until she told me she'd grown up on a farm in Missouri and had been on horseback since she could walk. That part of her hadn't been taken either. She sat easy in the saddle even on the second day, when I could see the soreness in the way she moved on the ground. She didn't complain. She didn't talk much, but she watched everything. The land, the birds, the way the grass moved. Once she stopped her horse and just sat looking at a line of cottonwoods along a creek, and I let the others go on ahead and waited with her, and after a minute she said, "I used to think about trees, down there. Used to think about what a tree looks like in wind. Couldn't quite get it right anymore after a while. The way the leaves move all at once." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She looked at the cottonwoods a little longer. Then she put her heels to the horse, and we caught up with the others. That night, the second night, midway to Ridgeport, Chayton made the fire and the others were settled, and me was sitting at the edge of camp looking out at the dark the way she'd taken to doing, like she needed to see far. I brought her some food and sat down nearby, not close, and ate my own. After a while she said, without turning, "You're sad." I thought about denying it. I don't know why. It was true. I said, "I've been sad for a while." She said, "How long?" 6 years, about. She turned then and looked at me. I told her about Winona. I don't know why I told her. I didn't make a habit of it. But it came out plain, and she listened the way she listened. And when I was done, she didn't say she was sorry or that things would get better. She just said, "She sounds like she was a real person." I looked at her. She said, "I mean, when people talk about someone they've lost, sometimes the person comes out flat. Like a story. Yours didn't." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "She was real. She was the most real person I ever knew." Me nodded. She looked back out at the dark. She said, "I think that's the best thing you can say about someone." We sat for a while longer. Then she said, in a different tone, matter of fact, "You move through your days like a man who's waiting to be done with them." That landed hard. It landed hard because it was true. Not that I wanted to die, it wasn't that. More like I was going through the motions of living without expecting anything to come from them. The chief of a diminishing people, widowed, past 50, doing the job because I didn't know what else to do. Waiting, I suppose, without knowing I was waiting. I didn't answer her, but I didn't pretend I hadn't heard her either. She didn't say anything else that night. She rolled in her blanket she'd taken to sleeping facing the fire, and I sat there for a while longer looking at the dark. Ridgeport was a collection of buildings that had convinced itself it was a town. 2 streets unpaved, a general store, a livery. The army outpost, which was a glorified barracks with a flag and 2 soldiers who looked perpetually surprised to be there. A saloon, a structure that was supposed to be a hotel. We came in on the morning of the 4th day, and I watched Me's face as she took it in. The walls, the angles, the closeness of things, her jaw set, her hands tightened on the reins. I took her to the army sergeant, whose name was Tillman. a heavy-set man with a beard growing and patchy and red. I explained what we'd found. He wrote things in a ledger. He asked me questions and she answered them shortly. He said he'd send a report east and see about contacting any family, and she told him plainly that she had no family, and he wrote that down too, looking uncomfortable. When we came out of the outpost, me stood in the street and looked around at the rooftops and the narrow gaps between buildings, and I could see her doing the arithmetic. What she was walking out of, what she was walking into. I said, I can leave you some money, enough for a few weeks at the hotel. She looked at me, that's generous. It's decent, I don't know if it's generous. She said, what are you going to do now? I told her I'd ride back west. My people were camped 3 days that direction on the Elkhorn. I had council matters waiting. I had a life, such as it was. She said, can I come? I looked at her. She said, I'm not asking to be kept, I'm asking to come. She paused. I can work. I've been sitting in a hole for 7 years and my hands feel useless. I need to be somewhere with space and something to do. I thought about it, not for long. The thinking I'd done about what to do with her, it occurred to me, had all been about depositing her somewhere and leaving. None of it had asked her what she actually wanted. She'd been asking that question herself, to me, to Tillman, to the open air. What did she want? And what she decided she wanted was not a town with walls and a ledger entry. I told her it wasn't easy country. I told her my people were Lakota, and some of them would have opinions about a white woman in camp. I told her I couldn't promise her anything. She said, I'm not asking for promises. I've had promises. They're not worth much. I said, all right. We bought her a better horse with the money I'd been going to leave her. She insisted on that, traded, actually, got the sergeant's man to throw in a saddle that fit. She knew what she was doing. She came out of that with $2 and a blanket besides. Chayton, when we rode out of Ridgeport that afternoon with me beside me, looked at me over her head with an expression I knew. Not surprise. Something like recognition. He nodded very slightly and looked back at the trail. The camp was on a flat above the Elkhorn, sheltered on the north side by a long bluff and open to the south where the river bent. We'd been there 6 weeks. We'd moved before fall. There were 40-some people there, families, elders, young men. A good camp, orderly, the horses picketed in good grass. When we rode in, the first few days were what they were. People watched. Children pointed. A woman named Coda, who was the wife of my cousin Running Creek and who had opinions about everything, made her opinions known to me in private and at some length. I listened, and then I told her me was a free person and where she slept and what she did was her business, and if Coda treated her as anything less than a person, she'd have me to deal with. Coda wasn't afraid of me, but she thought about it and she subsided. Me did not stay to herself. That was the thing. You might have expected her to, given everything, given the strangeness of the situation. Instead, she walked into the work of the camp the way she'd said she would, hands first. She could tan a hide. She'd learned something about prairie plants coming up out of Missouri, and she spent time with the older women comparing names and uses. Her Lakota was non-existent, but she was quick with language, picked up words fast, used gesture and expression and sheer willingness in the gaps. Within 2 weeks, the younger children had adopted her completely. That's usually how it goes. Children don't calculate. They just see who's present and willing. I watched all of this from my own angle. I had council business most mornings. I rode the range with Chayton most afternoons. In the evenings, I was where a chief is, available, present, holding the various tensions of a community together the way you hold a rope that's pulled from 3 directions. But I watched. She was coming back to herself. I could see it happening day by day, the way you watch a plant that's been in the dark come back when you move it to the light. Not dramatically, not in a rush, just incrementally, steadily, a little more of her filling back in. She slept outside for the first 3 weeks. Even on the cold nights, she'd roll her blanket out under the sky. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Sometime in the fourth week she moved inside to the lodge I had set up for her near the fire circle, but she started leaving the door flap open. I understood all of that. I didn't need it explained. What I didn't expect was the way she'd started looking at me. It came clear on a morning in early fall. The first frost had hit the night before, just a light one, the kind that leaves the grass white and crackling at dawn and is gone by mid-morning. I'd woken early, the way I did, and I was standing at the edge of camp looking out at the river, drinking from my cup, my breath making small clouds. She came up beside me, quiet. She'd gotten quieter in her movement over the weeks. I didn't know if that was something she'd always had or something the camp had given back to her. She stood there and looked at the river. After a while she said, "You look at the world like you're mad at it for going on without you." I said, "That's a particular way to put it." She said, "It's what I see." I turned to look at her. She was looking at me, not the river. Her face was in the early light, that gray-eyed steady look, warmer now than it had been when she'd come up out of the cellar, more life in it, more color, but the same quality of attention. She wasn't saying it to needle me. She was saying it because it was true and she thought I ought to know. I said, "I've been the chief of a band for 12 years. I've done right by my people. I've kept them together. I've buried my share and more. I don't know what more you think I should expect from the world." She said, "Yourself." I looked at her. She said, "You keep talking about your people like they're the reason you're still here, and maybe they are, but you're not in there with them, Lakota. You're in front of them, and there's no one behind you." I stood there. The river was moving. The frost was starting to thin in the first real light. I said, "Winona was behind me." She said, "I know, and she's gone." We stood there for a little while longer. Then she said, "I was in that cellar for 7 years. I had nothing. No sky, no light most of the time, nothing to do, no one to talk to except the worst kind of men. And I held on. I held on because I thought somewhere out there the world still had something in it that was worth coming back to." She paused. "I found out it does." She walked back toward the fire. I stood there at the edge of the water and I let that in. Let it sit. It had been a long time since anyone had said something to me that I had to sit with afterward. Most people, you hear what they say and you know what to do with it. This one, I needed time. What happened next happened slowly. I want to say that plainly, because it would be easy to tell it as though it went fast, one conversation, one moment, and then everything shifts. It wasn't like that. It was the accumulation of 100 small things over the weeks, the way a fire builds not from one log but from the particular way each piece is laid. She asked me things nobody had asked me in years. Not about the band, not about politics or territory or the coming winter. About me, what I thought about. What I'd wanted to be when I was young, what my father had been like. I talked. I don't know why I talked, except that she listened in a way that made talking feel worth it. Like the words were landing somewhere, not just going out into the air. I told her about my father, who had been a horseman above all else, could read a horse the way some men read tracks, by the set of its ears and the quality of its eye. I told her about the years before the grief and the diminishment, when the summers were long and the hunting was good, and I had been young enough to believe that things would hold. I told her about Winona, more than I had that first night. Not the dying but the living, the way she'd laughed, which was sudden and total, the way she'd argued with me, which was without mercy, the way she'd slept with one arm thrown across her face. Me listened to all of it. She didn't rush me through the hard parts or flinch from them. She just held the space, the way certain people can. And she told me things in return. Not all of it. There was a core she kept sealed and I didn't push. But she told me about Missouri, about her father's farm, which had been a good farm, with a woodlot and a creek and a barn she'd loved better than the house. She told me about a horse she'd had at 14, a roan mare with opinions, and how she'd cried harder when that horse died than she had over half the people she'd lost since. She said that and then she laughed a little, and it was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it was like watching something come on at a distance, not sudden, just real. I remember the exact moment I knew. We were mending a fence line at the north edge of camp, a job I'd taken on myself because it needed doing, and because I find that kind of work good to think in. Me had come along without being asked, and we'd worked companionably for the better part of the morning. She was driving in the last stake on the line and the mallet slipped and she caught it before it hit the ground, and she looked up at me. Just the automatic look you give someone when something nearly goes wrong. The "here did you see that" look, and she grinned. It wasn't much of a grin, it was small and quick. But her eyes were in it, and it was the first time I'd seen her face completely unguarded, and something in me, something I'd thought was settled and done, something I'd told myself was finished and sealed and given its proper burial, moved. I looked back down at my work. I didn't say anything, but the something that had moved didn't settle back down. I didn't do anything about it for a long time. I want to explain that, because it's not the part of this story that's pretty. When you're past 50 and you've been carrying grief for 6 years, and you've told yourself a certain story about who you are now and what you're for, a man of the people, a chief, a man who had his good years and his great love, and is now in the chapter of his life where he just does the work, it is very hard to let that story go, even when the letting go would be better for you. There's a kind of pride in grief. I don't know how else to put it. The holding on becomes part of how you think of yourself, faithful, steadfast, honoring what was lost. The idea of putting that down and picking something else up can feel like a betrayal. I told myself I was being appropriate. She had been through 7 years of damage, and she was still finding her way. She didn't need anything complicated from me. She needed stability and space and time, and I was providing those things, and that was the right thing to provide. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was afraid. Afraid to want something that could be taken again. Afraid to step out of the safe dead place I'd been living in and back into the world where things happen to you, where the living hurt as well as the dying. Chayton saw all of this, of course. He saw it before I'd admitted it to myself. One evening he sat down beside me and said, "There is a thing you are not doing." I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He looked at me with all the patience of a man who has been watching his chief make a slow mistake. He said, "When you found her in the cellar, you gave her back the sky. That was your nature. That was the best of you." He paused. "She is trying to do the same for you. Let her." I sat with that for a long time after he'd gone. The night it came to its head, there was a storm. You don't get warning on the plains, not always. This one came from the northwest in the middle of the night, thunder first, then lightning walking across the sky in great white steps, then wind that drove the rain horizontal. We'd had worse storms, but not many. The horses were spooked. A section of the north wall on 2 lodges needed to come down or risk pulling the whole structure. I was up before it hit. I don't know why, some sound in the air, some change in the pressure. I was already moving when the first real gust came through camp. The next 2 hours were work. Hard work in rain and wind and cold, half of us in various stages of undress, moving fast, securing what needed securing, calm-voicing the horses. I won't say I forgot myself in it, but I stopped thinking and just moved, which is its own kind of relief. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I was working with 2 of the younger men on the North Lodge wall, all of us with our shoulders against it, the wind doing its best, and I looked across the camp and me was there. She'd taken 2 of the children, Koda's youngest, and a little boy named Hako whose mother was heavy with her third, into her lodge, and she was standing in the door with one arm around each of them, both of them pressed into her sides, looking at the storm. She looked up and found me across the camp. I couldn't have told you why that particular moment. The 2 of us with the whole chaos of a night storm between us, and she looked up and found me, and she just held my eyes. steady, like a lodgepole, like she was telling me something without words the way you can when you know a person well enough. I held the wall for another 10 minutes and then the gust eased and the wall held and I stepped back. I was soaked through and my bad knee was aching from the effort and the cold. I walked across camp to where she was standing in her doorway. The children were half asleep, one leaning against each of her hips. She looked at me for a moment. Then she reached out just her right hand. She had the boy in her left arm and she put her hand on my face. Wet hand, cold from the rain, against my jaw. Her thumb found the edge of my cheekbone. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I stood there and I let myself be still. It sounds like a small thing, a hand on a face, but you have to understand what a long time I'd spent not being touched like that with care, without asking anything back, just a person saying with her hands, "I see you, I am here, you are not alone in this." 6 years of being the one who held everyone else together, the one who stood in front, the one who never let the weight show. She held her hand there for a moment, and then she lowered it. She said quietly, because the children were close to sleeping, "You should get dry." I said, "So should you." She almost smiled. I went to my lodge and changed into dry clothes, and I sat by my small fire and I thought about Winona. I sat with her memory the way I had 100 nights, not with pain exactly, not anymore, but with a kind of gratitude that took time to arrive at. She had been real, and she had loved me, and I had loved her, and that didn't end. It didn't need to end for something else to begin. It was the first night in 6 years that I felt that clearly. I talked to me the next morning. The storm had blown itself out, left the camp wet and the air washed clean, that smell you only get after big rain on the plains, sage and grass and turned earth, almost sweet. The sky was the particular deep blue of a morning after storm. She was sitting outside her lodge with a cup of tea, her hair still damp, watching the children try to build a dam in the runoff channel. I sat down nearby. I told her the truth, that I had been in a held place for a long time, that I had been moving through my days like I was waiting to be done with them, as she'd said, that something had been changing for me, that she was part of what had changed it, and that I didn't know exactly what to do with that, but that I didn't want to keep not saying it. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She looked at the children for a while after I'd finished. Then she said, "You know, in that cellar, the worst of it wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the men. The worst of it was thinking that I had disappeared, that I was becoming invisible, that the person I'd been was going away piece by piece because there was no one there to see me." She looked at me. She said, "You see me, Lakota. You've seen me since the first morning when I came up out of that dark. You didn't look through me. You didn't look at me like I was a problem to solve. You looked at me like I was a person." Her voice was even, matter-of-fact almost, but her eyes were not. She said, "I want to do that for you. I think I already have been a little. I want to keep doing it." I said, "I can't promise you easy." She said, "I know, I'm not made for easy." I said, "My people will have opinions." She said, "They've been having opinions. Coda told me last week that I was going to end up one of the family whether she liked it or not. I think that was a compliment." I thought about that. Coming from Coda, it probably was the highest one available. I said, "This is your free choice, not obligation, not gratitude." She looked at me steadily. "Don't insult me," she said. "Of course it is." I looked at her. The morning light, the washed blue sky, the children arguing in the runoff channel. I reached over and I took her hand. She turned it over and held mine back, her fingers settling around my palm. We sat like that for a while without talking. The children's dam collapsed. They shouted in triumph or disaster, hard to tell which, with children. I felt something in my chest that I recognized that I'd thought was gone. Not the same as it had been with Winona, it never is the second time, nor should it be, but real, warm, the particular weight of being seen. I should tell you the rest, because this is not the end of the story. There is no end exactly, only where a person decides to stop telling it. Winter came hard that year, the way the old-timers had been predicting, the way the geese had been saying if you watch them right. We were prepared. We'd laid in enough, moved to the winter camp in the valley that the bluffs sheltered from the north, kept the horses close. Me spent the winter doing what she'd been doing, working, learning, building. Her Lakota came on faster than anyone expected. She made Chayton laugh twice in 1 week, which he later told me was unprecedented. She learned the beadwork patterns from an old woman named Suda who was 90 years old and had strong opinions about everyone but who took to me with something that looked, from the outside, like approval. She sat with Suda every day for 2 months and came out of it with a precision of stitch that impressed people. She also turned out to be what I'd guessed she might be from early on, a healer of a practical sort. Not medicine woman knowledge, not ceremony, but the rough and ready kind of healing that comes from necessity and observation, and a willingness to stay in the room when things are bad. She kept a kind of running account in her head of what she'd seen and done in that cellar, the small ways she'd kept herself, and even twice, others alive. She had knowledge. She was not gentle exactly, practical is the better word, but she had steady hands and a clear head and people came to trust her. My knee did not get better. It was not going to get better, I knew that, and she didn't waste time pretending otherwise. What she did was learn to work with it, the way she came to understand other things about me, which positions were worse, what cold and wet did to it and what warmth helped. She found a trade for willow bark and a particular root the Pawnee used that I'd never tried. It didn't fix things, but it took enough of the edge off that the bad mornings were manageable. One morning in the deep cold of February, I woke very early and the knee was bad, had been pinned against a rock in the night, I thought, and I was lying there doing the arithmetic of getting up, which was all angles and the question of which hurt less. She was awake too. She usually was early. She sat up and came around and put her hands on the joint, both of them, and she just held the warmth there while I breathed through it. She said very quietly, "Still here." 2 words. She didn't look up from what her hands were doing. I said, "I know." She said, "Not talking about the knee." I knew that. I put my hand over hers. The cold outside was immense. The hide walls caught the firelight and made the whole space amber and close. The camp was still. I said, "I know." Chayton asked me once, just once, in the way that Chayton does things once and then lets them be, whether I thought about the shape of my life differently now. We were riding the winter range, checking on the horses and on a place in the fence line we'd shored up before the snows. Cold day, good sky, breath coming in clouds. I thought about the question for a while before I answered. I told him, yes, not that my life was easier or that what had been hard was now not hard. The band was still diminishing, the world outside was still pressing, the losses were still losses, the knee was still the knee. But I didn't feel like I was waiting anymore. I didn't feel like a man walking through his own life with his hands in his pockets, waiting for it to be over. She'd done that. I don't think she'd set out to. I think she'd just been herself, direct, present, clear-eyed, stubbornly alive after everything they'd done to try to put her light out, and being herself had been what I needed. Like finding a door in a wall you'd stopped believing had any. He nodded, he said, "She told me something once." I waited. He said she'd told him, in the early days when her Lakota was still mostly gesture, that she'd thought a lot, down in that dark, about whether people existed if no one could see them. Whether she was still a person, still real, when no one was there to witness it. He said she'd told him that the first time she really believed she was real again was when I'd said, from the top of those cellar stairs, "The door is open." I rode for a while with that. Then I said the lock was already broken, she'd done that herself. Chayton said, yes, but she needed someone to open the door. We rode the fence line. The cold was deep and clean. Far out, maybe a mile, the horses were moving in the morning snow, dark shapes against the white, their breath making small clouds. I thought about that. About the way things go, how a man can be so deep in his own diminishment that he stops seeing it, stops knowing it as something he might climb out of. How it takes another person, sometimes. The right particular person who comes up out of the dark with those gray eyes and says, "You are moving through your days like a man who's waiting to be done with them," and chooses to stay. I didn't go looking for what she gave me. I wasn't in a position to. I'd been chief of a band for 12 years, widowed for 6, 53 years old with a bad knee and a back that gave out in the cold, and a territory that got smaller every season, and a life I was doing mostly from habit. I was not a man expecting to be surprised. But here is what I know, and it is the only true thing I know to tell you about any of it. There is a kind of woman who has been through the worst that the world has and come out the other side still whole, still watching, still choosing, and when that woman looks at you and decides, with everything she's seen and everything she could have done instead, to stay, that is not a small thing. That is not luck or accident or just how things fell. That is a gift. I have been chief of my band for 19 years now. I have buried friends and elders and 2 young men I taught to ride. I have watched the territory change and pressed against every change I could push back on, and I have tried to hold the people together through the seasons that were grinding and the seasons that were good. Me has been beside me for 7 years. 7 years, which is how long they kept her in that dark. She says she thinks about that sometimes, the symmetry of it, how time works the way it balances. I don't think much about symmetry, but I think about this. I was a man going through the motions of living, hollowed by grief, moving through my days without expecting anything from them. She came up out of the dark and turned her face to the sun. And then she turned it to me. Some mornings I wake early and the camp is still, and the light is just beginning to come in along the eastern edge of the sky, that first pale line before the color arrives, when the world is holding its breath. She's usually awake already. She's always been early. She'll be sitting in the door of the lodge with her cup, looking out at that light the way she still does, the way she did the first morning we found her and she turned her face to the sun. I sit with her. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't, the knee complains, the day takes shape. I used to think of the life I had with Winona as the life I would always be measuring the rest against. And then I thought the rest was just the aftermath of that life, the long diminishing chapter after the good one. I was wrong about that, not about Winona, never about her, but about what was left. What was left was this: a woman who'd come up from 7 years of dark and decided, with full eyes open, that this land and this man and this life were worth staying for. Who held my face in her hand in the middle of a rainstorm. Who sits in the door of the lodge in the early morning light like she is drinking the sky in and will never, as long as she lives, take it for granted. I spent 6 years waiting for my life to be over. I've got a better use for my time.